they have, since about, I think yesterday, really seriously started to move forward towards Donbass.
I think his original calculations were very much based on his own personal views about, mythology and Russia's place in the world and a great Russia. And so some of the goals and the way that they chose to do this were run essentially from the Kremlin, not necessarily from military professionals. What's happening now is I think Putin is at least trying to find some way to have a win, to show that, that he's not giving up. He's a strong man. He's not going to admit that they're losing or that they've miscalculated. He's just going on another path, and hopefully a path that for him that will be more successful. The Ukrainians have been fighting against the Russians in this area for at least the last 8 or 9 years. And so they understand the Russian way of war. They understand that they cannot give up, because giving up means they lose their nationhood altogether. And so I suspect that we're going to see a long and grinding war, which is quite bloody. And I suspect that, Russia's goals will continue to be hard to meet.
Has he succeeded to rebuild his brain to get the proper information that would reflect the reality on the field?
So Vladimir Putin was a career KGB officer. So he's always placed his intelligence services at the front and foremost of his foreign policy and his domestic policy. So he's used the FSB, the Domestic Security Service, to stop any opposition inside the country and to jail anyone who's a threat, jail or kill anyone who's a threat to Putin. And he uses intelligence community around the world to spread disinformation and sabotage and subversion into things many of us have now seen quite openly for the last several years. And so I think as the war began, yes, I think he relied very heavily on the intelligence community and some of these hybrid warfare, political warfare, cyber attack type of things that we've seen. And he relied on the FSB, which handled Ukraine, which is unusual. So that for the Russian intelligence services, the SVR is the foreign intelligence service, the FSB is their domestic service. But the FSB was in charge of Ukraine. Essentially, they were treating Ukraine as if it was sort of an internal province. And in some ways, I think that was the mistake. I think they misunderstood, the growth and the democratization and the professionalism of the Ukrainians, because they assumed it was, like it was during the Soviet days. And so I think we've seen recently reports that Vladimir Putin has fired some key leaders, that he may have fired a number of FSB and other intelligence officers. But certainly Vladimir Putin has to find somebody to blame for his mistakes. When you're a dictator and you portray yourself as a strong man, you can't blame yourself. And so you have to blame somebody else. Also, it probably is true that the intelligence services have been giving him sort of, poor information. But essentially, again, that's much of his doing. He's created a system over 20 years where everybody knows what he believes and he wants to hear. And so I'm sure his leaders have been providing him the answers that he wants to hear, because if they provide him something else, he's likely to sack them. One more thing is there always has been quite brutal bureaucratic battling between the military and various intelligence services amongst themselves. That's not unusual, and I think Vladimir Putin has used that to maintain control. He's allowed some people to be up sometimes, and he's pushed others down at other times. And so I do think if we read the tea leaves right here, what's happening is the military is trying to also blame the intelligence services and gain more value in Vladimir Putin's eyes. But that may not last depending on what happens on the battlefield. Yeah, I mean, modern society, it's truly impossible to control everything. And that's obviously the weakness of dictatorships. If everything has to go to the top for decision-making purposes, it's very difficult to be efficient and effective. And so he's created that system which really relies on him. People aren't going to take, big decisions on their own for fear that the boss is not going to like it. And so, yeah, I think, their intelligence services are professional. They have people around the world. They have more intelligence officers around the world, I think, than the United States and Western countries do. And so that, they do have the ability to, understand things. They have their military, even though it's embarrassed itself and looks weak here, still has some professionals who can, still do quite a bit of damage and create quite a bit of havoc. And so I think that's the kind of thing we're going to see. But, at the end of the day, Vladimir Putin it's his war, it's on him, and it's unlikely that he's going to sort of loosen the reins to allow others to make key decisions. But let's remember that Vladimir Putin has been lying to his people for 20 years. All of the media inside the country is telling lies about what's happening. This war was set off on a lie. All of the things that he claimed to be true that he was doing weren't true. The Ukrainians aren't Nazis. They weren't threatening Russia. NATO wasn't enlarging into Ukraine. All of these things, he completely made up. They just weren't true. He's essentially created this false world to his own people. And so he can claim victories and claim that the West and the United States and NATO and Ukraine are doing terrible things, and he's defending them from this. And he can claim that as a victory. So I think his commanders would like to have some sort of victory on the ground, if you will, but it doesn't really matter because he's going to claim victory anyway.
Putin was aiming at really invading the whole Ukraine and overthrowing Zelensky's administrations. Do you think that he still keeps that ultimate goal?
Vladimir Putin has, over the years, developed this sort of messianic view of Russia power, of sort of creating a greater Russia, and that Ukraine is part of Russia. So I do not think he's going to change his overall goals. He's continued to act consistently over the years with the things he believes in. Now, on the battlefield, they might not be as easy as he thought they were. He'll have tactical goals that have been unmet. But I think what we're going to see is they're going to, try to push and control areas in the Donbass. I think this war is going to go much longer than we think. It's going to be grueling, and there's going to be both sides pushing and seizing areas and back and forth. I think he will see that in some ways as a win for Russia, in that Ukraine is going to be weak in the near future. It's going to constantly be a small country with a economy that's in a bad state, that's having to fight Russia, always having to worry that Russia might move in farther or take more land. But as long as he's in power, the Ukrainians understand that he has the ability to again try to advance or to attack or to invade further. And so as long as he's in power, they have to worry about Vladimir Putin trying to destroy Ukrainian nationhood. Now, they've shown with their bravery and their skill on the battlefield that they will not surrender. They will not give up. And so Ukrainian nationhood has been essentially created for the future. This is going to be something that's going to be studied in schools in Ukraine for years. There's going to have heroes of people. They will not give in to, Russia subsuming their country. And so I think Vladimir Putin in some ways is sort of the father of Ukrainian nationhood. But I think there's going to be a lot of blood and pain, and it's going to reverberate around the world. We're seeing economic impacts in places like Africa and Sri Lanka, and even here in the United States and in Japan.
Are we talking about months, years, or decades?
It's so hard to know because, again, it's one person's decision. I think he is willing to, this goal is so important to him that he's willing to spend Russian resources for quite a long time. And like I said, the Ukrainians will not ever give up. And so this could be a long, cold crisis that continues for potentially years, yeah. I think the notion that Ukraine joining NATO was the reason for the war, I think is not true. I think it's something that he uses as an excuse. He has a variety of beliefs, strong-held beliefs he's had for a long time in terms of his views of the West or his views of countries in his neighborhood. And so not joining NATO, Ukraine wasn't about to join NATO anyway. It was very unlikely that Ukraine was going to be part of NATO. So, saying that they're not going to join NATO, he can probably spin that as a victory back home, but it's not a victory in a real sense. And what's happening at the same time, he's showing, because of his actions and brutality, that other countries are realizing that joining NATO is the best way to protect yourself. So countries that are traditionally neutral, like Sweden and Finland, are now discussing joining NATO. So Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine not because it was thinking of joining NATO, but because it wasn't in NATO. He did not go into Baltic countries and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania exactly because they were in NATO. He did not go into Poland because they're in NATO. He took advantage of what he thought was a weakness and a weakness in the West to respond, to see something that he's always wanted to do. And so, yeah, Ukraine, can say that they're not going to join NATO, but I don't know that that's the linchpin or key that's going to solve this crisis.
How Putin is fearing NATO? What is the level of threat that he's feeling from NATO?
Yeah, it's a very good question. In a practical sense, it doesn't make sense. NATO was not growing. NATO didn't have massive sort of troops in Europe. There's never been an effort by NATO countries to suggest that they were going to invade or attack Russia. But he's used this as a threat to his own people. When his own economy was weak or other things, he would have to have somebody to blame, a scapegoat, and say, oh, this is because of the West and NATO, they're a threat. When it's a big, massive landmass that has been invaded over the centuries. And so there's some, historical view that, Russia needs to always be growing and expanding to protect itself. But it's that growing and expanding and imperial mindset, which is what threatens his neighbors and forces countries to want to join NATO. So it's a very difficult situation in that sense.
Is it more like a paranoia or?
It's paranoia, but paranoid people sometimes believe they're paranoia. He's been lying and creating for so long that it's not clear whether he started to believe his own lies.